Metroid Other M. What can be said about this game that hasn't already been said? Reviled by fans as the worst Metroid story ever told, just about every negative aspect of its plot has been criticized to hell and back. From the poor execution of Samus's character, to the unremarkable supporting cast, to the infamous monotone, repetitive narration, Other M really did drop the ball in so many areas. It's kind of a shame because the game isn't without its merits. Lest we forget that this is when Samus doing flashy finishers became the norm. Alas, even the best made games can be bogged down by poor writing decisions, but there's no denying the sheer potential Other M had was staggering, making it all the more painful that its execution ended the way it did. I could sit here and do what dozens of others have before me, listing off my complaints with every single aspect of the story, but I want to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to take those criticisms and see if I can't try my hand at offering a slightly different take on this pivotal chapter in Samus's life. So, with all the preamble out of the way, let's dive in and explore a somewhat different take on perhaps the most reviled Metroid game of all time. Before we get too deep into the actual story, let's take a moment to address one of the most infamous aspects about this game: the motherhood symbolism. One of the core conflicts Samus faces in Other M, as I'm sure we are all well aware by now, is the death of the baby Metroid she adopted in Metroid 2. This is meant to be a story about how Samus handles grief, particularly grief over losing a child. And the premise lends itself to a very interesting take on our stoic, badass bounty hunter. A shame that premise is handled with all the subtlety of a power bomb. Metroid Other M can be abbreviated as MOM. Other M is an anagram for mother. The game takes place on a space station called the Bottle Ship, and the word baby is said over a dozen times throughout the entire campaign. Now, in all fairness, some of this can be attributed to the English localization of the Japanese script. And there are some great video essays about that out there if you're interested in checking out the comparisons between versions. Regardless, there's no doubt that the overuse of motherhood symbolism is one of the game's biggest detriments. I mean, let's be honest. The baby Metroid itself isn't really that big of a focal point in the story anyway. Save for a few specific scenes, it's rarely ever brought up or referenced after the intro. For those unfamiliar, the Metroid in question was the last of its kind that Samus rescued from SR-388. She was sent to the planet to wipe these creatures out because they were a bioweapon created by the Chozo, who had evolved out of control and posed a threat to the entire galaxy. After killing the Metroid Queen, Samus comes across an egg just as it hatches and encounters an infant Metroid that imprints on her. Samus, perhaps recalling her own tragic childhood, opts to spare this last, relatively harmless Metroid and brings it to the Federation for study. The baby is then stolen by Ridley, escapes confinement, and ultimately sacrifices its life for Samus to give her an edge in the final battle against Mother Brain. Hell, its DNA would later go on to save Samus's life again in Fusion. But for as important as this Metroid is to her, Samus barely even got to spend all that much time with it. Not to say she wouldn't or shouldn't grieve, but I don't think the loss of what is essentially an adopted animal quite compares to the loss of an actual child. Even so, the loss of the baby Metroid is still important to the game's overall plot, so starting off with the animated cutscene of Samus fighting Mother Brain is fine. The only real changes I'd make to the scene is cutting out the part with Samus as a space fetus, her little one-liner toward Mother Brain, and maybe making the Hyper Beam rainbow colored like it was in the original, if only so that it doesn't look like it's just a basic charge shot. After that, however, is when we really start to change things up. In the original game, they transition from the Hyper Beam shot to Samus waking up in a hospital chair. This was always strange to me. It feels really abrupt, especially because it doesn't really line up with the order of events we know. Like, it's implied Samus went into some sort of coma after fighting Mother Brain and was saved by the Federation, but that's not what happened. As Mother Brain dies, a self-destruct sequence initiates that threatens to destroy the entire planet, implied to be one last spiteful act to kill Samus from the rampant AI. Players are given a timer and urged to escape before it reaches 0, and then we get to the end of Super Metroid. So, here's my proposal. Rather than take place in some random training room, the escape sequence should be our tutorial. You could play through the ending of Super Metroid in Other M's 3D style, fighting your way through the exploding planet to reach Samus's ship. Perhaps we could even say that the excessive use of the Hyper Beam overloaded Samus's suit, causing her to lose all of her beam upgrades save for the Charge Shot and reverting her back to the Various suit, because we always need an excuse for why Samus can't use her old powers. After escaping from Zebes, Samus reports to the Federation's parliament, as she does in the original game. Everyone applauds Samus for yet another successful mission, but Samus herself seems cold and detached as she gives her report. Then, as she nears the end, we can have a very brief scene to show us what's going on in her mind. I confronted the rogue AI, Mother Brain, and... Samus pauses briefly, her eyes flickering downward. The screen flashes back to a still shot of the baby Metroid being blasted apart by Mother Brain, then cuts back to Samus in the audience chamber. Defeated her. Then, Samus concludes her report, and leaves. That's it. That's all you have to do. No long, droll monologues. Just that one scene to inform players what's going on in her head, and then we leave it there. That being said, I don't think giving Samus internal monologues is an awful idea. I mean, it worked in Fusion. Granted, the reason why is because her internal dialogue actually had a purpose in that game, rather than her musing on every little thing that happens. If you're going to have monologues, they need to have a point and they need to be sparse. So, in this version, we'll cut to Samus flying alone in her ship after leaving the Federation. She begins to reflect on her life as a bounty hunter, and her time before that in the military. Maybe a little something like, I thought it would get easier with time. Being a bounty hunter means that you can make your own decisions, choose for yourself what's right and wrong. Time and again, I've been faced with difficult choices, and I'm not always sure if the path I choose is the right one. Once, I had someone to make those decisions for me, when I was still a soldier in the Federation Army. Sometimes I ask myself what he would have done in my place. Sometimes, I wish I could ask him directly. It's here that we would initiate a playable flashback scene of a younger Samus fighting under the command of her superior officer, Adam Malkovich. Samus would be accompanying Adam on a mission alongside the rest of his team, the 7th Platoon. Now, the nature of this mission could honestly be just about anything, but for the sake of this rewrite, we'll say it's to take back some kind of MacGuffin from space pirates. The main point of this scene is to establish Samus's relationship with Adam and her teammates, all of whom are severely underutilized characters in the original game. Be honest, aside from Adam and maybe Anthony, do you actually remember any of these characters without looking them up on the wiki? I certainly didn't. So let's give them a brief rundown, shall we? Going forward, I'll effectively be trying to write up personalities for these characters based on what precious little we actually know of them. First up is Lyle, the team's demolitions expert. Beyond that, all we know about this guy is that he has a fear of bugs. So, in this flashback, let's make him a little cocky. Maybe we can have him trying to show off to the newbie, Samus, by demonstrating how he doesn't need some fancy Chozo tech to take out a tough enemy. Basically, this game's Rivali, but slightly less of a prick. He seems cool and suave, only to lose his cool when a bug monster suddenly shows up. Samus saves him, then gives him a little smirk under her helmet before moving on. Next we have Maurice, the platoon's engineer. He's basically the techie of the group, the guy who maintains and repairs equipment. I like to imagine that, unlike Lyle, he'd be super into the Chozo tech thing and constantly tries to ask Samus about the inner workings of her suit, much to her chagrin. Even so, he's dependable when you need him, and tends to follow orders to a T. Then there's James, the communications expert. What exactly does that mean? According to the internet, it apparently refers to someone whose job is to nurture and develop relationships. Like a group therapist, I guess. I can maybe see the benefit of having one of those, but not out in the field. So yeah, since Adam's team apparently doesn't have one, let's instead just make James the medic of the group. I like to imagine him as someone who's easygoing, but a little introverted. He takes his job seriously, but also gets annoyed when or if his teammates get themselves injured. I'd like to imagine he and Samus get along well enough, though he does have to remind her now and then that her power suit, while sturdy, doesn't make her invincible. Keep in mind that she would be rocking the basic power suit here, as she has yet to acquire the Various suit. And while we're on the topic of James, let's address the elephant in the room. In the original game, James was a traitor planted onto Adam's team to slowly kill off everyone investigating the station to ensure no witnesses were left. Even though the Federation supposedly authorized Adam's team to investigate the distress signal in the first place, Other M tries to have this whole murder mystery thing going on where you try to figure out who's killing off your friends, and in the end, the killer was apparently James. Not that it matters, since he ultimately gets himself killed by random monsters off screen. So yeah, the whole deleter subplot ultimately goes nowhere and accomplishes nothing. So yeah, we're gonna retcon that. While I think the deleter as a concept could work later on, we're not gonna have it be James, or anyone on Adam's team for that matter. With that said, let's get back to the roster. Next up is Keiji Misawa, the team's scout. In the original game, we learned basically nothing about this guy. In fact, he apparently only speaks 2 lines in the entire game, with one literally just being "got it" in response to an order. So, based on that, let's assume that Keiji is a bit of a stoic, no-nonsense type. He doesn't talk much unless it's relevant to the mission and takes his job very seriously. I'm envisioning a scene where Samus is tasked with accompanying Keiji on recon, but while trying to strike up a conversation, she fails to notice an enemy sneaking up behind her. Keiji saves her and lectures Samus to stay quiet and focused when scouting out new areas. Basically, she adapts that habit from him in all her solo adventures going forward. Now we move on to Anthony, basically the black guy of the group. I wish there were a nicer way to put it, but that really is his personality in a nutshell. Before his name was revealed, the fandom even referred to him as the MBD, the mysterious black dude. But in all seriousness, Anthony's actual role in the story seems to be the heavy weapons expert, as evidenced by the chargeable plasma cannon on his back. Of all the Platoon members, Anthony is the most fleshed out and gets the most screen time, for better or for worse. The thing is, I don't really dislike Anthony. I think the problem most people have is how familiar he acts towards Samus when we, the audience, are just meeting him for the first time. I mean, there's a reason why his line, "Remember me," has become something of a meme in the community, with the response, of course, always being, "No, we don't." Aside from that, though, I can't say I have too many gripes with Anthony's character. He's friendly, outgoing, and seems very protective of his comrades. It's a little basic and could stand to be fleshed out more, but I think the foundations of Anthony's character work well enough. Anthony could be considered the heart of the group, effectively. I can easily imagine a big fight scene where he's the one making snarky quips until one of his squad mates gets hurt. Then Anthony gets serious and busts out the plasma cannon, regardless of whether Adam orders him to or not. And that leads us on nicely to the big man himself, Adam Malkovich. Adam's character history is interesting. Most fans will know that his name first cropped up in Metroid Fusion. There, Samus ruminates on her days in the Federation and gives the player exposition about her old commanding officer, Adam Malkovich. We don't get to learn too much about him in that game, other than the fact that Samus harbored a great deal of respect for him and that he sacrificed himself for a mission some time ago. During the events of fusion, Samus is given a new gunship with an AI installed, which reminds her of Adam. This isn't coincidental, as apparently the Federation deemed Adam such a valuable asset that they based an AI off his personality. Basically, they brain scanned him. By the end of the game, this AI effectively becomes Adam himself and assists Samus in getting off the BSL station alive. Needless to say, players are given a lot of information about Adam in this game without so much as ever seeing what he looks like, and Other M wanted to try and flesh out that backstory. Needless to say, Adam's portrayal in Other M is one of the most divisive aspects of the game, along with all the heavy-handed symbolism. For someone who is supposed to be such a skilled and competent leader, enough that the Federation literally brings him back as an AI, Adam comes off as basically the exact opposite throughout the story. I mean, the wiki literally dedicates an entire section of his page to common fan criticisms of his character. Such criticisms are fairly well known at this point, but we'll address them a bit later on when they become more relevant. For now, let's focus on Adam's role in the flashback scene. Overall, Adam's demeanor and personality won't change much. He's the stoic, calm, and collected leader of the group who can think fast and make tough decisions on the fly. Contrast this with a younger Samus, who Other M tells us is meant to be brasher and more impulsive. The whole "any objections, lady" line is supposed to be Adam's way of teasing Samus for the fact that she's often questioning his orders. Needless to say, Adam will be the one calling the shots throughout this brief flashback level, telling players where to go and what to do. It would be a good way to let players get better acquainted with Samus' standard arsenal without the Hyper Beam. That being said, the player doesn't get to reach the end of the flashback scene just yet. Just as you reach the end of the section, the flashback cuts off and we return to modern day. We cut back to Samus in her ship, sometime after her mission on Zebes. She says nothing, simply staring out into space, until she sees an incoming transmission on her dashboard. It's a distress beacon from an unidentified source, a standard SOS. And no, we are not calling it Baby's Cry. The transmission is brief and consists only of a muffled voice declaring themselves under attack. Samus tracks the beacon to its source, a mysterious space station drifting by itself in a mostly uncharted region. For the record, we are once again changing an overly egregious mother symbolism and retconning the name Bottle Ship. The station's new name will be revealed a bit later on, but for now, Samus's main priority is finding a docking port and getting aboard to assess the situation. This scene can play out mostly like the original. Samus docks and runs past a lone Federation ship before exploring the station a bit. She finds the place abandoned and eerily quiet, but after players make their way further inside, a cutscene triggers. Samus is walking through an abandoned corridor alone, until she notices another set of footsteps. She wheels around and points her arm cannon at the source, only to find a lone Federation officer pointing a weapon back at her. A familiar voice speaks out, commenting that Samus appears to have taken his advice to heart. Samus's eyes widen beneath her visor as the stranger reveals himself to be Keiji, the 7th Platoon scout. Not long after, the other members of the team catch up to him, just as surprised to see Samus as she is to see them. Anthony greets her warmly, and Maurice seems to take note of the fact that Samus's power suit has changed since their last encounter, obviously referring to the fact that she now has the Varia suit. The reunion is quickly interrupted, however, when Adam himself approaches Samus, creating a sort of awkward tension in the air. He addresses her plainly, asking if she also came to investigate the distress beacon. Samus confirms Adam's suspicion, but before anything else can be said on the matter, Keiji calls out a strange skittering noise in the walls around them. It's here that players initiate their first boss fight against the Bug Mass, just like in the original. And yes, I'm going to be saying bug instead of brug because the latter just sounds dumb. Anyways, the boss seems unbeatable at first, until Adam authorizes the use of freeze guns. Same boss as before. The platoon freezes parts of the boss's body and Samus has to blow them up with missiles. We will of course have Lyle expressing his disgust in the background, but not completely freaking out. A subtle hint that he's reined in his phobia a bit since that flashback scene. After defeating the bug mass, the team briefly discusses what to do next. Adam insists that they continue on with the investigation, and Samus volunteers to aid them. Some members of the team are eager to work with her, but Adam appears apprehensive. He insists that this is an official Federation investigation, not something for outsiders to get involved in. Rather than having Samus monologue to us about how that word stings, we just have the two stare at each other in silence for a moment. Samus then insists that Adam hire her. It wouldn't be a problem if she was working with the Federation in an official capacity as a contract bounty hunter. After a little coaxing from the rest of his platoon, Adam ultimately agrees to take Samus on due to her expertise in situations like this. Also, needless to say, no authorization mechanic this time around. Now, the whole power limiting thing was always a controversial decision in the original game. We all know that Samus has to lose her powers so that she doesn't just start each entry with an overpowered kit. And we've had some admittedly contrived reasons for it in the past. The idea that she has all her powers but simply can't use them is interesting, and it sort of makes sense in the context of the game. You're on a space station, investigating a distress signal and searching for survivors. It does make sense that you'd not be allowed to use certain volatile weapons unless the situation called for it. However, disabling features like the gravity suit, beam upgrades, and the various suits' freaking heat insulation is just ridiculous. Also, it just makes Adam seem condescending, like he doesn't trust Samus not to just blow up everything in her path. Granted, a lot of her missions do end up with space stations and planets exploding, but that's usually the antagonist's fault rather than her own. That's why I want to have most of those upgrades lost as a result of the hyper beam overloading Samus' suit, leaving her with just the power beam, charge shot, and missiles. To regain her lost powers, let's say that Samus needs to find energy cores or something throughout the station. Rather than keeping her upgrades locked until she's allowed to use them, Samus can't use them until she restores her suit to its full functionality. If nothing else, it's better than the contrived authorization mechanic we got in the original. After securing Samus's cooperation, Adam has Maurice access a nearby terminal to pull up any and all records he can. Maurice manages to access a map of the station, which they come to learn is called Beta Facility. The entire structure appears to be split off into several sectors, including a lab, power plant, residential zone, testing ground, and factory. Unfortunately, all other information regarding the station or its purpose are classified, and will take time to access. Immediately, you'll notice differences between my beta station and the bottle ship. The latter was split off into several artificial biomes made to study creatures in their natural habitat. It was a research station, effectively, except that's literally what the BSL station was in Fusion. You know, a place to clone and study organic life forms in simulated environments. I mean, we literally even have the same twist of, oh, the Federation is illegally making bioweapons here, including Metroids. So yes, we are changing what the beta facility is in addition to its name. Its true purpose will remain a mystery for now, but the important thing to note is that a lot of settings will change. I get that having different areas with different elemental themes is a Metroid staple, as well as just a Nintendo staple in general, but there's no reason we couldn't veer away from that for one game, right? Especially since Other M takes the character action game approach rather than being a 2D search action or, Metroidvania, or even really an FPS like the Prime games. This game is its own beast, so why not take the opportunity to break away from the norm and explore some different level aesthetics? But I think that's a good place to start wrapping this video up for now. What secrets does the beta facility hold? What fate awaits Adam and the rest of his platoon this time around? Find out in part 2 of Rewriting Metroid, Other M.